is making me more stressed than standing in front of a room full of 15-year-olds. Part of which I think is due to the fact that they were legally obligated to listen to me. So, bear with me. Just to get started, I know a lot of you. I don't know everyone. And I'm curious, is anyone here not familiar with the Colles Club? Okay, a couple hands. Okay, so for those of you that are not familiar with the Colles Club, it is a private club. It is about 3 blocks south of here. It was created in 1968. It is, again, private. Do not go knock on the door and ask for a tour. That's not the vibe. And the center, it's not a very large club. It's not like a country club. There's no golf course. But it does have a pool and some other facilities. And the centerpiece is this home. Now, back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, my family were members of the Colles Club. And I grew up in 20 Farragut Place, diagonally across from the Colles Club. And I remember very distinctly, as a young kid, having somebody tell me that the Colles Club house hadn't been built by the Kellogg's. And I remember being puzzled, and I thought, well then, who built it? And the answer was, well, the Colles family. And I said, oh, like the street. And that was the end of it. And I sort of never heard about the Colles family after that. I did an undergraduate degree in history, a graduate degree in American Studies. I taught history for 20 years in the high school level, most of which, pretty much every year I taught US 1, which is up to and including the Civil War, up to about 1900. And the Colles family never showed up. So I feel like maybe those of us who are fans of local history, who love this part of the country, maybe we get blinded a little bit by the luminaries of Washington and Hamilton and Lafayette, and then later on with the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and all those guys who showed up, those bold-faced name people who spent time here. And in shadows, the Colles family has gotten lost. And I think maybe we could do something about that. Maybe we could adjust that a little bit. Maybe it's time for them to get a little bit of attention. I don't know where the feedback is coming from, so we can try not to move so much. Okay, so this is the Colles family, pictured in 1872. This picture's going to come up again at the end. You'll know a little bit more about who everybody is. But when I talk about the Colles family, these are our 2 main protagonists, James Colles and Harriet Augusta Wetmore Colles. And James Colles was born in 1788, lived to 1883, lived 95 years, good, healthy, long life. And Harriet Augusta Wetmore, she lived also a very long life. They got married when they were in their 20s, and they were married for about 50 years, very happily married, very much in love. I want to talk a little bit about who they are, so you kind of have an idea of who they are, then go into their backstories, what they did before they met, then a little bit of how they made their money, what they did with it, before we turn our attention to their kids. So to get an idea of who these 2 were, like I said, they were very much in love. They call each other, he called her Hal, she called him Coll, and lots of letters like, my dear Coll. They had very different personalities. She, as described by her granddaughter, was devoted to her family, and we were all fond of her, but a little afraid of her too. After all, she was hospitable and loved to fill the house with her grandchildren and children to its utmost capacity. My grandmother was good, strong, and true. Just love that as a quote. But this granddaughter goes on to say the life of the home centered around my grandfather. He had a lovely disposition, never seemed to worry about anything. Everyone loved him, and by his grandchildren, he was simply adored. He would sneak food for them at the table, and he'd take them around the property with the dogs. And the granddaughter said, is it any wonder that we loved him? So he's definitely the favorite. Very, very charming, where maybe Harriet Augusta was the one that got everything done. Okay, so in terms of their backstory, so James was the son of an Irish immigrant, and his dad had emigrated from Ireland about 10 years before James was born, And his mother was a member of a long-standing Dutch family. They'd been in New York for generations. His parents were fairly well off, Protestant, buried in Trinity Church Graveyard in New York City. They don't just let anybody in there. So pretty established family. But his father dies when James is 19 and he has to make his way in the world. And one of the things he does as a fairly young man is he becomes a smuggler during the War of 1812, like you do. So Passamaquoddy Bay in Maine is, on one side was American territory and the other side was British territory. And it got very dicey in there. And James was able to get into the sort of society of both the loyalists and the folks working on the docks. And he managed to become especially close with the folks who tried to corral the smugglers. And what he would do is he would point out to them the ships that he had, he was working with the company, and he would point out their ships to the customs officials and say, look, there's a whole ship full of contraband. Look, go get it. And they would go and get it, and they'd take everything off the boat, they'd count it all up, and then they'd have an auction for this contraband, and the only person bidding would be James Colles. And because he had pointed out to them that it was coming in, he would get a quarter of the cost of the goods as a bounty. So there was one bounty where it was $100,000 worth of goods, and he got $25,000 as his own personal cut. So did very well. And a professor at the Merchant Marine Academy described him as having a charisma that smoothed his way in the commercial world. And he was an ambitious young man, full of self-confidence, tightly bonded with his social peers, accustomed to a life of privilege, yet unceasing in his pursuit of wealth. So he did all right. Now, in one of those loyalist homes that he frequented was the Wetmore family home. And I don't know if he heard about Harriet in one of those sort of meetings, or he just knew the Wetmore family, became familiar with them, but he meets up with Harriet a little bit later. They actually meet in Baltimore, but she spent a good chunk of her childhood in Morristown with her very amazing looking mother. So really fantastic visage. So Rachel was the daughter and wife of men who had fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the British. And as an exchange for their service, they got land in Canada. And so the family moved to Canada, and like the mother and the for ducklings did not like the environs, did not want to raise her children there, so moved the family south. And she had 10 children, one of whom had married into the family that was working at the Speedwell Iron Works. So she ends up in, I think, basically Morris Plains. She buys a house in Troy, which is like Troy, so Parsippany Way. And she says the property is lovely. She said the property was a lovely and healthful spot of rich farming land, and they were among an intelligent and hospitable people. So we got good marks from Rachel. Unfortunately, not long after moving here, her husband dies, leaving her with a bunch of children to feed, and so she moves to Morristown and opens a school. First, she opens a shop on the corner of South Street and the Green, and then she opens a school for sort of, young ladies. Reading, writing, geography, English grammar will be taught if required. It's a boarding school, so she takes in these girls. They have to be well recommended. They have to be of a certain social class. But she runs the school for several years. Harriet is the math teacher, and there's a little bit of a squabble with the Scribners. It's a side note. And so she moves the school to Baltimore, and that is where the two of them meet. That is where James and Harriet meet and get married. Now, James, at this point in the early 1820s, is making money as a merchant from New England to New Orleans. And Harriet spends a couple years after they get married in New Orleans, not so fond, decides to stay in Morristown with her sister, and the two of them buy property with their husbands, of course, south of the Green. So the Green is there, and then down here is the James Colles property and the Joseph Lovell property. So they bought the Dowdy farm, General Dowdy Street. They bought that farm and then lived together for a little bit, and then split the property, and the Colleses get the eastern half. While Harriet is in Morristown and James is in New Orleans, she writes him this letter, which is just adorable. So she says, "My very dear husband, Morris is now truly delightful, and I only want your society to make me quite happy. I do indeed smell a sweet flower or look at a lovely prospect without feeling, do not indeed smell a sweet flower or look at a lovely prospect without feeling regret that you cannot partake of it with me. The clover fields are well in bloom, the sweet roses also. I have never seen Morris more beautiful than it is now. I fear by the time you come, half of its beauties will be parched up by the heat of the summer. I cannot tell you how much I want to see you. I sometimes think I am almost childish about it." So this good, strong, and true woman was like besotted with her husband. So very, very lovely. And while she's in Morristown, and they're home in New York, James is making a ton of money. This is from I went to the New York Public Library and read some of their papers. That was super fun. Oh my God, I loved it. But this is from his journal from one of his I don't know, his records, ledgers from the 1840s. It's his handwriting, so if you can't read it, this is cash. It's $108,000 in cash in 1840. I looked it up, the average wage for farmhands in New Jersey in that time was 50 cents a day. So you made some money. And this is only one part of it. This is only his bonds. There's other securities, and there's thousands upon thousands of dollars of investments. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because not exactly clear how he made that money. Yeah, it's a little dicey. I've seen him described as an art dealer for plantation owners, as a dry goods salesperson, as a luxury goods salesperson, as a grocer, as a merchant. His brothers, some of Harriet's brothers, her brothers-in-law, some of Harriet's brothers, sort of try to settle part of Arkansas, and he bankrolls them. I think he did a ton of real estate investing, real estate development, and then one of the things that I think played the biggest role is the fact that in 1823 he received a letter that said he'd been appointed the president of the Second Bank of the United States branch in New Orleans. So he was the president of the Bank of the United States in New Orleans, and Lord knows I spent too much time boring high school kids with the details about how the bank worked. But suffice to say, it was a main engine for the development of the Mississippi Delta region. And inherent in that development is slavery. And the Colles family owned slaves. James Colles sold people. He absolutely 100% defended slavery. He writes letters about how the British were sort of insisting that we end slavery and he wouldn't have any part of that. And then I just recently, as of Monday, got this book by Sharon Ann Murphy. She's a professor at Providence College, and it's called Banking on Slavery, Financing Southern Expansion in the Antebellum United States. And I hadn't quite realized until recently that the Second Bank of the United States, particularly New Orleans, was a leader in allowing people to borrow money off of the value of their people they had enslaved. And yeah, creepy and awful and brutal. And it was a collateralization of humans that banks sometimes found easier than borrowing off of real estate because they were more easily sold, which is awful. And the rotunda in New Orleans where they had slave auctions almost every day was just a few blocks from where James Colles' office was at the Bank of the United States. So it is an inherent part of that wealth. I don't know what percentage. I will most likely one day ask my husband to let me go to New Orleans to read his papers, but it's coming at you. So anyway, so one day I can get more of that answer. But so having amassed all of that wealth, Colles sells his store, sells his business to John Peter Nelson. And Nelson, by the way, was the largest slave owner in New Orleans, in Louisiana. He had 1,400 acres and 900 slaves. So Colles retires. He gets out of the business, retires, moves back to Morristown full time, and he and Harriet do the grand tour. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Grand Tour. It's like the thing to do. You go off to Europe, you do the Grand Tour. I hadn't realized that they actually had tour guides. And maybe it's like foolish of me, but this is their tour brochure from when they were doing a tour of the British Isles. It sort of tells what they're going to do each day. They spent 3 years in Europe. They did 2 winters in Paris, 1 winter in Rome. They did the British Isles one summer. They did Germany another summer. And they at this point, they have 5 kids. They have 5 kids that live to adulthood, 2 daughters, 3 sons. The 2 daughters went on the Grand Tour with them. James stayed at boarding school in New York City, missed the whole trip. John Henry and George Wetmore go with them, but with their nanny, Mary McBride, and they get dropped off at different boarding schools. So they spend a year in Switzerland, they spend a year somewhere else. And this is where Harriet's character comes through, because John Henry, her 10-year-old son, is writing her letters from his boarding school in Morristown, and she's writing him back correcting his spelling. And not my choice. I wouldn't have done that, but it's all right. So he chooses then to start writing her letters in French, because maybe he's got an edge on her. I don't know, but he decided to just bypass that whole thing altogether. So they spend a couple days. James is writing letters home, and he writes descriptions of what he sees. Of England, he said, "The country is beautiful beyond description. Were it not for the many distressed-looking laborers we meet, it would be a kind of paradise. In fact, riches here are very unequally divided, the overgrown fortune and the squalid poverty." He said, "We have but few cases like that in our country. In the United States," he said, "every man can, if industrious, earn a living and make himself respectable. Long may it continue so." He said, "I'm struck with the grandeur of England, but all in all, I feel proud of being an American citizen." Now, when you go to Ireland, where he meets cousins and he meets family, he says the roads are excellent and the country much better cultivated than I expected. In some districts it was very fine, everything was pleasing, except for the wretched hovels of the peasantry and the miserable manner in which they were generally clad. It appeared to one, the lower order of peasants in Ireland are really totally indifferent to their personal appearance from the universal ragged and dirty garments they wore on all occasions. This is 1843. That's not a good year for Ireland. But anyway, it says, they are truly quite poor and probably much misgoverned, you think? Anyway, but they have at their hands always the means to make themselves clean and tidy if they wish. So maybe a little Harriet sort of had an impact on him. Then they go to France, and they get to meet the king. King Louis Philippe of France. So they like him. James says he's a good man and a good king. And his subjects don't deserve him, because they're depraved. So there you have it. This is what he wore to meet the king. I don't think that's him, I think that's his son, but that's what his outfit. And then Harriet, this is what her daughter described. She wore a brocade satin with 3 diamond brooches down the corsage, a blue turban trimmed with bands of silver, and pearls and bouquets of diamonds on each side, and a diamond dove on her forehead and a diamond bracelet. So, tons of cash still. This is the worst. Okay, sorry. This is a receipt from Tiffany in Paris. They bought their silverware at Tiffany's. And this is a list of some of the furniture that they bought to be shipped home. It's not exhaustive. I'm not exactly clear if it was for the house in Morristown, if it was for their house in New York, if it was for sale. Apparently they filled over 5 ships full of furniture to send home. So quite the shopping trip. Now, the other thing, which maybe some of you who are more familiar with antiques have seen this, but they got there, they bought a carriage to carry them around. And then everywhere they went, they took stones. So they took serpentine from the baths of Caracalla, porphyry from the Roman Forum, scraps of earth from Pompeii, and then they made it into a table, which apparently was all the rage. Like the Coliseum. We've stolen parts of the Coliseum and put it in the table. Okay, so by the time they get back, the house a couple blocks out here has been built. Martin W. Townsend is the architect. And in the early 1800s, he had designed the Bank of the United States branch in New York City. And you may find this familiar because the facade is currently on view at the Met. So that's that building, stunning room, right? And the same architect who built the house down the street. So this is building the house, furnishing it, buying all the fancy clothes. It's part of what they did with their money. But upon return from Europe, James Colles in particular really desperately felt that New York City needed a fancy opera house. And so he built, with his friends, the Astor Place Opera House. It was on Astor Place, which is now Lower East Side, Manhattan. It was incredibly fancy, and it was made even more so by the fact that the wealthy subscribers got couches in the orchestra section. So you would like reserve your couch for the season, and then people could buy tickets for the upper levels, but like the wealthy were there to see and be seen. And they had the Fireman's Ball in, I think, 1847. So it's a fancy, fancy place, made intentionally aristocratic. This doesn't end well. So maybe Colles didn't know, but there were two actors, Shakespearean actors, who had a massive feud going on. On the left is William McCready, who's British, and on the right is Edwin Forrest, who's American. And it just so happened that 175 years ago this week, the Astor Place Opera House put on a production of Macbeth starring William McCready. And then in the Bowery, there was another theater that was putting on a production of Macbeth with the American actor. And the Irish people who were all over the place in the Five Points District in Lower Manhattan were not keen on a British actor portraying Macbeth. They had no problem with the play. They had no problem with Shakespeare. They had no problem with any of that. And in fact, I don't know Macbeth that well, but there's a line in it where he says, what rhubarb senna or what purgative drug might scour these English heads. And apparently this delighted the Irish. They were like whooping and hollering, so excited that Macbeth has this anti-British vibe. They were not happy about Macready's performance. So they bought tickets to the play on May 10th, and they seat in upper levels, and they start throwing things at Macready, and they start throwing chairs. Macready has to do the play in pantomime. He can't even speak. They can't even get their words out, and it's a disaster. And then the next morning, Macready books passage to go back to England. He's like, I'm out of here. I can't do it. And Herman Melville, Washington Irving, implore him, beseech him, please stay, do another play. He's like, okay, fine, I'll do it. Okay? So he does, which is the worst idea. It's on May 10th in 1849. So these are the flyers that they handed out, all the Bowery boys were going to show up to protest the English aristocratic opera house. And then there's a riot. The Astor Place Opera House riots. 22 people are killed, 150 are wounded. Is one of the largest, most violent incidents in New York history before, I guess, the Civil War. The highest number of Americans killed by the government is the militia killed them before the Civil War. Somewhere in there between the Revolutionary War and that. So, not a good scene. Frances Colles is actually at the Opera House that night, and she has to run away with a scarf over her head to make sure that she survives. And it's a powerful inflection point because from this point on, first of all, James Colles retreats from trying to do anything that ambitious ever again. And most of what you consider to be the more highbrow entertainment moves north in the city. So as long as the millionaires move north as well. And so you have all of this sort of, more sort of prestigious institutions now more in Midtown. And that's not entirely the case. It's changed a little bit, but yeah, it's a bad scene. Okay, so Any questions? All right, I'll keep going. All right, so turning to the children. The three boys, James Colles Jr., John Henry Colles, George Wetmore Colles. The girls, Augusta Colles Metcalf and John Metcalf. He's a doctor, very well known, very prestigious. And then Frances Colles marries John Taylor Johnston. The five of them have, and there's anywhere between 10 to 12, 14 grandkids running around the Colles family home in Morristown. And they would gather particularly for July 4th. And let's see if I lost my notes. Okay, so they gathered particularly for July 4th. There was one summer where, in 1863, where the July 4th celebration was not particularly festive. Frances Colles Johnston wrote a letter to her brother George. It is absolutely breathtaking. I have copies of it if you want to read it. It's too long for me to read the whole thing, but in 1863, Harriet had just passed away in childbirth, and the child passed away as well. John Henry is fighting for the Confederacy. George W. is fighting for the North. James is off doing business, and the only one in Morristown is Frances. And she writes to her brother, I cannot complain or want animation about the house, for imagine 9 grandchildren, all well and full of spirits, meant to have a gay time. No dinner party or fireworks, of course, but the little ones can be happy without that. I must tell you about Edith and Fanny, these are James and Harriet's grandkids, how they celebrated Frank's birthday, which came 2 days ago. Edith had made 3 cents by sewing for Grandma, and Fanny had 3 cents I had given her. They had permission from Ma to go uptown to Miss Nevins accordingly. You can just picture them walking uptown from the telephone, right? Can't you just picture it, these little kids? So they asked for tallow candles. They told there were none in the store. Right? Edith looked perplexed and said she meant fireworks. And they asked if she meant Roman candles, which she did. So she bought 6 cents worth of same. And having asked the Radford children all congregated on the side steps of the gallery, Nick Johns fired them off amid shouts and hurrahs. She continues, we have lively moonlit nights now and sit in the piazza at the southern corner and talk and think of all our dear ones and feel that their spirits are here with us. So those of you who've been in Calico, you can sort of picture that, ooh, okay. Sorry about the feedback. So this is, back to this picture. This is James sitting in his favorite chair. This is Frances. This is John Taylor Johnston. This is George W. I think that's his wife. And then their kids are around. It's in 1872. Harriet's already passed away. He is not actually mowing anything. It's just still, he had to pause and pose, pretending to be writing, mowing the lawn. This is the letter, part of the letter I just read to you. The handwriting is just killer. She talks about watching the news and being fearful of everything that's happening. But let me go back to these two. Okay, so Frances Colles Johnston and John Taylor Johnston. Have any of you ever heard of them before? Okay, awesome. Okay, so I was amazed, as I had no idea that who they were. So John Taylor Johnston, with John Kane of the Kane family, North New Jersey's Kane family, were the owners of the Central Jersey Railroad. And they owned the railroads that went from the coal mines in Pennsylvania to Jersey City. And they also owned the coal mines, and they also developed the property along the railroad, right? They built the Central Jersey Railroad Terminal in Jersey City, which is still there. And they built this house in Plainfield called Netherwood. It's no longer there, but I found an article that said that Johnston, because he controlled the railroad, because he could determine where the train would stop, he put a train station at Scotch Plains, and his family was from Scotland, so that's where that name comes from. Why else? What? Scotch Plains? Anyway, and then he called Frances Fanny, and the thought was that Fanwood is named after Frances Colles. Again, why don't we know this? Their main house, though, was at 8 Fifth Avenue. And it stood out among all of the other houses on Fifth Avenue, because it was entirely covered in white marble from Vermont. Johnston's family was wealthy. His father was one of the creators of NYU. His sister and her husband created Bard College. They developed all of the property at northern part of Washington Square Park. They were doing all right. And this house was fairly large, but it had a garage in the back, and Johnston filled it with artwork. He was an avid art collector, and he loved like the Hudson River School. He loved sort of huge, enormous landscapes, and he opened the garage either every year or every week. I've seen both in what I've researched. And he would let the public come see what was in there. This painting, which hopefully you can see, is called The Slave Ship, or has a subtitle, which is important. Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On, by J.M.W. Turner. And in the front of the image are the bodies of people who have been sold, who have been thrown overboard, and in the back is the ship. It's from an actual event that happened in 1781. The slave ship was called the Zong. And this person, the captain, the monster who was controlling the boat, decided that he had people on board. He intended to sell into slavery, but they were sick and he didn't think they would make it. And so he knew that if he threw them overboard, he would get insurance money for people who had been lost at sea. But he wouldn't get any money if they just died of natural causes. And so this painting was exhibited in London as part of an anti-slavery convention in 1840. John Taylor Johnston purchases it for his own private collection and then sells it in 1876, and it's currently on display at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so you have his father-in-law financing the expansion of the United States through the collateralization of human beings, and John Taylor Johnston owning this and possessing it, keeping it his own private collection. The garage event ended up not being big enough. So on December 19th, 1870, John Taylor Johnston invites all of his friends, all of his besties, to his house, combines like J.P. Morgan, invites J.P. Morgan, invites painters and artists, and he sells to them the idea of creating an art museum for the city of Manhattan that is sufficient to sort of match the immense sort of glory that is New York City. And that's the beginning of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so John Taylor Johnston was its first president. He served for 18 years as its president. He financed the purchase of 1871, which is the first collection of paintings that the Met acquired. And then his daughter, Emily Johnston DeForest, was married to Robert Weeks DeForest, who was the second president of the Met. And they donated the American Wing, so like you do. So that is what's really fascinating is that in this picture, well, in the meeting in 1870, where they created the Met, George W. Colles was invited. None of the other Colleses are there. Again, they're both in this picture, Frances and her brother George. There's a bit of a schism that happens. And it's about the inheritance, not surprisingly. I found I should have showed you the picture. I found a very suspicious document written in George's handwriting in their archives in New York City, where he writes that he has control and property of all of his dad's wealth. And there's this, and it's just like, I get everything because you're here, because James stayed in the house and George and his wife were there, so like, you're here, so we're gonna take all of your money. And I guess that the other family members didn't particularly like that. And there's a lot of angry letters from Colles Johnston in particular going, hey, make with some money. Like, we have to settle this. George ends up with the house, ends up with the property, and many of you might be familiar with the fact that he was the one who came up with the idea to develop the neighborhood. It was Colles Historic District. And they moved the house to here, and then they carved out the different streets to develop. People could build their own homes, depending on what they liked. George had a gas company, so they laid the gas lines before the homes were built. The family names, Colles, Ogden, Wetmore, and then Farragut was a family name because one of Augusta Metcalfe's daughters married the son of Admiral David Farragut. So Farragut was a family name. So there's so much more to the story, but that's all I have for you tonight. So that's